Welcome, dedicated truth seekers, to Beyond Midnight. If you haven't already, take a moment to subscribe and join our community as we delve into the darkest corners of history, peeling back the layers of myth to reveal the stark, often brutal, realities that shaped our world. Tonight, we journey back to an age often romanticized, an era of exploration, conquest, and legendary warriors. But beneath the sagas of valiant heroes and daring voyages lies a truth far grimmer, a foundational horror that fueled much of the Viking Age, the systematic and widespread practice of human enslavement. Tonight, we confront the chilling reality of the horrors of a Viking slave market. When we picture the Vikings, images of longships cutting through icy waters, of fearsome warriors with horned helmets, an anachronism perhaps, but a powerful one, and of epic feasts often come to mind. We envision their prowess as navigators, traders, and founders of new settlements. But this heroic narrative often overlooks the grim underbelly of their success, the relentless pursuit, capture, and trade of human beings. Slavery in the Viking world was not a peripheral activity. It was an economic cornerstone, a driving force behind their expansion, their wealth, and their very societal structure. The men, women, and children ripped from their homes and sold into bondage were the unseen engines of the Norse machine, their suffering an unacknowledged cost of the Viking Age. The sources, both archaeological and textual, paint a consistent picture. From the sagas themselves, which casually mention the acquisition and sale of thralls, to the skeletal remains bearing the marks of a life of hardship, to the Arabic accounts of bustling markets where human lives were traded like livestock, the evidence is undeniable. The Vikings were not merely raiders. They were sophisticated, albeit brutal, entrepreneurs in the human flesh trade, establishing vast networks that stretched from the shores of Ireland to the steppes of Russia and even further east. Imagine, if you can, the terror of a sudden raid. The dawn breaks not with the promise of a new day, but with the shriek of a war horn, the pounding of feet, and the guttural shouts of men speaking an alien tongue. For the inhabitants of coastal villages in Anglo-Saxon England, Francia, or the Celtic lands, this was the nightmare made real. The longships, those elegant instruments of terror, would appear as if from nowhere, disgorging a torrent of armed Norsemen. There was no warning, often no chance to resist. The initial onslaught was swift and merciless. Homes were torched, crops destroyed, and any who dared to stand in the way were cut down. But the primary objective, beyond plunder, was often the capture of people. Men were seized for their strength, women for their labor and their potential to bear children, and children for their long-term utility and malleability. The bond of family, the comfort of community, the very fabric of existence, was torn asunder in a matter of minutes. Parents watched in horror as their children were snatched away. Spouses were separated, never to see each other again. The air would fill with screams, with the desperate pleas of the innocent, mingling with the crackle of burning timber and the triumphant roars of the invaders. This was not just warfare, it was a harvest of humanity. Once captured, the ordeal was far from over. In fact, for many, it had only just begun. The journey from the raided settlement to the nearest Viking stronghold or trading post was a trial by ordeal. Herded together, often bound with ropes or iron chains, the captives, now known as thralls or cave-ends, were forced to march for days, sometimes weeks, through unfamiliar and hostile landscapes. They were given little food or water, just enough to keep them alive and moving. The weak, the old, and the sick were often left by the wayside, their lives deemed worthless, or worse, ended summarily to prevent them from slowing the group. The constant threat of the whip, the spear, or the axe hung over them, a grim reminder of their absolute powerlessness. The psychological torment must have been immense. Stripped of their clothes, their names, their identities, they were reduced to mere cargo. The language barrier created an impenetrable wall of isolation, amplifying their fear and despair. They were forced to witness atrocities, to endure humiliation, and to confront the stark reality that their lives were no longer their own. Every step taken was a step further away from home, from everything they had ever known, towards an unknown fate dictated by their new, brutal masters. These forced marches often culminated at one of the great Viking trading centers, places like Hedeby in Denmark, Birka in Sweden, or Dublin in Ireland. These were not just ports of call for exotic goods, they were bustling, cacophonous hubs of commerce, and at their very heart lay the slave market. Imagine approaching Hedeby, a vibrant, sprawling settlement nestled at the neck of the Jutland Peninsula. From a distance, the smoke from countless hearths would rise, mingling with the cries of gulls and the distant shouts of traders. As one drew closer, the smells would assault the senses: the brine of the sea, the pungent odor of animal hides, the sweet scent of amber, and unmistakably, the acrid tang of human fear and unwashed bodies. The soundscape was a chaotic symphony of human activity: the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the lowing of cattle, the chatter of a dozen different languages, and the incessant haggling over prices. But amidst this vibrant tapestry of trade, there was a darker undertone. The newly arrived thralls, still bearing the grime and wounds of their capture and journey, would be paraded through the market. Their arrival was often met with a mixture of curiosity, callous indifference, and sometimes the cold, calculating gaze of a potential buyer. They were no longer individuals, they were a commodity, an inventory. The inspection process was perhaps one of the most dehumanizing aspects of the entire ordeal. Buyers, whether they were local farmers, wealthy chieftains, or foreign merchants, would examine the thralls with the same scrutiny they would apply to a horse or a piece of pottery. They would prod and poke, checking for signs of injury or illness. Teeth were inspected to gauge age and health. Muscles were felt to assess strength. Women might be subjected to even more invasive examinations, their reproductive potential a key factor in their value. They were forced to walk, to run, to demonstrate their physical capabilities, all while naked or scantily clad, utterly exposed to the gaze of strangers. This public humiliation was designed to break the spirit, to strip away any remaining dignity. It was a stark declaration that they were no longer free, no longer human in the eyes of their captors, but merely objects to be bought and sold. Children, too, were subjected to this grim spectacle, their small bodies and wide, terrified eyes offering a particularly poignant testament to the cruelty of the system. A child might be valued for their potential to be trained, for their innocence, or simply as a cheap source of labor. The price of a thrall varied wildly, depending on a multitude of factors. A strong, healthy young man, capable of hard labor, would fetch a higher price than an elderly woman or a sickly child. Skills, too, could increase value. A thrall who possessed knowledge of a craft like carpentry, weaving, or metalworking might be considered a valuable asset. Women of childbearing age were often highly sought after, both for their labor and their ability to produce more thralls. The origin of the thrall could also play a role. Some buyers preferred thralls from certain regions, perhaps believing them to be more docile or more resilient. The transaction itself was a cold, calculated affair. Coins, silver arm rings, ingots, or even other goods might be exchanged. The buyer and seller would haggle, their voices rising and falling in the clamor of the market, debating the worth of a human life as if it were a sack of grain. Once the price was agreed upon, the deal was sealed, often with a handshake, a ritual that for the thrall marked the final, irreversible loss of freedom. Sometimes a thrall might be branded or marked by their new owner, a permanent tattoo or scar serving as a visible sign of ownership, a constant reminder of their enslaved status. Their names, if they were even allowed to keep them, would often be replaced with Norse names, further severing their ties to their past. They were no longer Eadwig or Ethelred or Bridget. They were Knut's thrall or Hilda's bondswoman. The buyers were a diverse lot. Viking chieftains needed thralls to work their extensive farms, to maintain their households, and to provide the manpower for their ambitious projects. Farmers required extra hands to plow fields, tend livestock, and harvest crops. Merchants often bought thralls not for their own use, but to resell them at other markets, sometimes transporting them vast distances across seas and continents, turning a profit on each leg of the journey. The eastward trade in particular was notorious for this, with Norse traders ferrying thousands of Slavic, Baltic, and even Frankish captives down the great rivers of Eastern Europe to the markets of Byzantium and the Arab caliphates. These thralls, often referred to as Slavs, which is the origin of the word slave, were highly prized in the Islamic world for their fair skin and strength. For the thrall, the sale was not an end but a beginning, the beginning of a life of unremitting toil, hardship, and fear. The journey to their new master's home was another anxious passage. They had no idea what awaited them, what kind of work they would be forced to do, or what kind of person their new owner would be. Would they be treated with a modicum of harsh benevolence, or would they face relentless cruelty? The uncertainty was a torment in itself. Life as a thrall in Viking society was one of the lowest possible statuses. Legally, a thrall was considered property, little more than a tool or an animal. They had no rights, no legal standing. Their master could beat them, maim them, or even kill them with little or no legal consequence. Unlike free men, for whom a wergild blood price would be paid if they were killed, a thrall's life had no such inherent value. If a thrall was killed by someone other than their owner, the compensation paid was to the owner for the loss of property, not to the thrall's family or for the loss of a human life. This legal framework underscored their utter dehumanization. Their daily lives were defined by labor. Agricultural thralls would spend their days toiling in the fields, planting, harvesting, and tending to livestock, often from dawn until dusk, regardless of the weather. Domestic thralls performed all manner of household chores, cooking, cleaning, fetching water, grinding grain, weaving cloth, and caring for their master's children. Some thralls, particularly those with existing skills, might be put to work as craftsmen, blacksmiths, carpenters, or weavers, their talents exploited for their master's benefit. Women, especially, were vulnerable to sexual exploitation, often forced into concubinage with their masters, their bodies and offspring becoming additional assets. Any children born to a thrall woman were automatically considered thralls themselves, perpetuating the cycle of bondage. The conditions were harsh. Thralls typically lived in rudimentary dwellings, often separate from their master's family, sometimes even in pits or simple huts. Their diet was meager, consisting of the cheapest and most basic foodstuffs, just enough to sustain their labor. Clothing was coarse and practical, offering little comfort or warmth. Disease, malnutrition, and exhaustion were constant companions, and life expectancy was significantly shorter than for free people. Beyond the physical hardship, the psychological toll was devastating. The loss of freedom, the constant threat of violence, the separation from family and culture, the inability to make any decisions about one's own life, all contributed to a pervasive sense of despair. Many thralls lost their original language, their names, their religious beliefs, forced to adopt those of their masters. Their identity was systematically erased, replaced by the identity of a subservient laborer. They were living ghosts, shadows of their former selves. One of the most chilling aspects of Viking slavery was the practice of human sacrifice. While not universally common, there is archaeological and historical evidence suggesting that thralls were sometimes sacrificed, particularly at grand funerals or religious ceremonies. The Oseberg ship burial, for instance, contained the remains of two women, one high-ranking, the other believed to be a thrall, possibly sacrificed to accompany her mistress into the afterlife. Accounts from Ibn Fadlan, an Arab traveler who witnessed a ruse, Viking funeral on the Volga, describe in vivid and disturbing detail the ritual sacrifice of a slave girl, chosen to accompany her master. She was subjected to ritualistic abuse, drugged, and then brutally murdered, her body placed alongside her master in his burial ship. Such practices highlight the absolute disregard for a thrall's life, demonstrating their status as disposable property, even in death. The threat of such a fate, or simply the daily grind of brutal labor, must have been an ever-present terror. Yet, resistance, though rare and often met with extreme violence, was not entirely absent. Runaways were hunted down and, if caught, faced severe punishment. Rebellions were brutally suppressed, but the spirit of defiance, however small, speaks volumes about the human will to be free. The economic impact of this vast slave trade cannot be overstated. Thralls were the bedrock of the Viking economy. They provided the labor force that allowed Viking farmers to cultivate larger tracts of land, producing surpluses that could then be traded. They built the longhouses, the fortifications, and even the magnificent ships that carried their masters across the seas. They were a valuable commodity in themselves, exchanged for silver, goods, and even land. The wealth accumulated by many Viking chieftains and merchants was directly tied to their ownership and trade of human beings. The roots of the slave trade were extensive. From the British Isles, Ireland, and Francia, captives were brought back to Scandinavia. From the Baltic and Slavic lands, they were funneled through centers like Birka and Graben, then down the great rivers of Eastern Europe, the Dnieper, the Volga, to the markets of the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic caliphates. The demand for slaves in these regions was immense, providing a lucrative incentive for Viking raids and expeditions. The silver hoards found throughout Scandinavia, often containing Arabic dirhams, are tangible evidence of this vast and profitable trade network. The legacy of this system is profound. It left an indelible mark on the societies that were raided, contributing to centuries of instability and fear. It shaped the demographics of the Viking world, with many thralls eventually integrating into the free population, albeit often through generations of hardship and slow social mobility. And it left a moral stain on the otherwise impressive achievements of the Viking Age, a stark reminder that progress and prosperity can often be built on the suffering of the most vulnerable. The very word slave itself, as mentioned, is thought by many linguists to derive from Slav, a testament to the sheer numbers of Slavic people enslaved by the Vikings and then sold across Europe and beyond. This linguistic legacy is a chilling echo of the past, a constant reminder of the human cost of Viking expansion. Consider the individual stories, the countless lives that were irrevocably altered. A young girl, perhaps no older than 10, snatched from her mother's side in a raid on a remote Irish monastery. She might have been destined for a life of domestic servitude, grinding grain and tending fires in a distant Norse longhouse, her childhood stolen, her language forgotten, her only comfort the faint memory of a lullaby. Or a strong farmer, captured during a raid on his Anglo-Saxon village, forced to labor in the fields of a powerful jarl in Denmark, his hands, once calloused from tilling his own land, now bleeding from the incessant demands of his new master, his spirit slowly crushed under the weight of endless, unrewarded toil. These were not abstract figures. They were real people, with families, hopes, and dreams, all extinguished by the brutal machinery of the Viking slave trade. The horrors were not just in the initial capture and sale, but in the relentless, grinding reality of daily life as a thrall. The constant fear of punishment, the physical exhaustion, the emotional desolation. There was no escape, no appeal, no one to turn to. Their lives were utterly at the mercy of their owners, who could choose to be relatively lenient or unimaginably cruel. And while some sagas speak of thralls eventually earning their freedom or being manumitted as a reward for loyalty or service, these instances were rare and hard-won. For the vast majority, bondage was a life sentence, passed down through generations. The very landscape of the Viking world bore the marks of thrall labor. The meticulously cultivated fields, the impressive ship burials, the fortifications that protected their settlements, all were in part products of enslaved hands. When we admire the craftsmanship of a Viking artifact or marvel at the scale of their agricultural endeavors, it is crucial to remember the hidden human cost embedded within these achievements. The prosperous trading towns, the vibrant markets, the impressive hoards of silver, much of this wealth was directly generated or facilitated by the trade and exploitation of human beings. The psychological impact on the enslavers themselves is also a chilling aspect to consider. To consistently treat human beings as property, to inflict such suffering, requires a profound dehumanization of the other. This mindset was deeply ingrained in Viking society, sanctioned by custom and law. It allowed for the casual cruelty, the indifference to suffering, and the systematic exploitation that characterized the slave trade. The Norse sagas, while offering glimpses into the lives of thralls, often reflect this societal acceptance, portraying slavery as a natural part of the social order, with little moral condemnation. This normalization of horror is perhaps one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire phenomenon. Even the very structure of Viking society, with its clear divisions between free men, carls, nobles, jarls, and thralls, reinforced this brutal hierarchy. A thrall could never truly aspire to be free. Their very birth condemned them to a life of servitude. This rigid social stratification meant that the suffering of thralls was not only accepted, but was seen as essential to maintaining the existing order and the prosperity of the upper echelons of society. The slave markets were not merely places of transaction. They were stages for the ultimate degradation. They were places where human dignity was stripped away, where lives were shattered, and where the future was irrevocably stolen. The screams of the newly captured, the silent despair of the inspected, the cold indifference of the buyers, these were the sounds and sights that define the horrors of a Viking slave market. They stand as a stark and brutal counterpoint to the romanticized image of the Viking Age, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath even the most celebrated historical narratives. And as we delve deeper into this grim reality, we must continue to confront the uncomfortable truths that history presents, no matter how unsettling they may be. For only by understanding the full spectrum of human experience, both the glorious and the grotesque, can we truly grasp the complexities of our past and learn its enduring lessons. The story of the thralls, the forgotten and voiceless victims of the Viking Age, is a powerful and necessary part of that understanding. It is a story of resilience, of unimaginable suffering, and of a system built on the systematic destruction of human freedom. The reach of this trade was truly global for its time. From the frozen north to the sun-baked lands of the Mediterranean, the paths of Viking slavers created a vast web of human misery. The Arabic accounts, particularly those from figures like Ibn Rusta and al-Masudi, speak of the ruse, as the Vikings were known in the East, arriving with thousands of captives, often destined for the harems and armies of the caliphate. These accounts are invaluable, offering an external perspective on the scale and brutality of the trade, corroborating the archaeological and internal Norse evidence. They speak of the thralls being castrated to serve as eunuchs, a particularly horrific fate reserved for male slaves in some eastern markets, further underscoring the extreme forms of exploitation they faced. The journey eastward, across the vast rivers and plains of what is now Russia and Ukraine, was an epic of suffering. The thralls, often from Slavic tribes, were packed into boats or marched overland, enduring exposure to the elements, disease, and starvation. The risks were immense, both for the thralls and their captors, but the potential profits were equally immense, driving the Viking merchants to undertake these perilous voyages year after year. The demand for slaves in the wealthy Islamic and Byzantine empires was insatiable, fueling a continuous supply chain of human misery originating from the north. Consider the sheer psychological impact on a person who is not only enslaved, but then transported thousands of miles from their homeland to a land where everything, the language, the customs, the religion, the very landscape, is utterly alien. Their original identity, already eroded by the trauma of capture and the degradation of the market, would be completely obliterated. They would be forced to adapt, to learn new languages, to adopt new customs, or perish. This cultural uprooting was another layer of horror, a final severance from everything that made them who they were. The very concept of family, so central to human existence, was systematically dismantled by the slave trade. Marriages between thralls were often not recognized, and any children born to thrall parents were the property of the master, who could sell them away at any time. This constant threat of separation, the inability to form lasting bonds or protect one's offspring, added an unbearable burden to the already crushing weight of servitude. Imagine the anguish of a mother watching her child being sold to a different master, knowing she would likely never see them again, powerless to intervene. This was the brutal reality for countless thrall families. Even for those thralls who managed to survive the initial capture, the arduous journey, and the dehumanizing market, and then found themselves in a relatively stable, albeit enslaved, position, the shadow of their past would forever loom. The scars, both physical and emotional, would remain. The memory of lost loved ones, of a stolen life, would haunt them. And the constant knowledge of their precarious status, their complete lack of freedom and agency, would be a daily torment. The Viking slave market was not a fleeting phenomenon, but a deeply entrenched institution that persisted throughout the Viking Age and beyond, gradually diminishing as the societies of Northern Europe Christianized and the economic landscape shifted. But for centuries, it was a brutal engine of wealth and power, built on the broken backs and shattered lives of countless individuals. It represents a dark chapter in human history, a stark reminder of humanity's capacity for cruelty and exploitation. And as we continue this journey into the depths of this historical horror, we will explore the nuances of this system, the various roles thralls played, the faint glimmers of hope that some might have found, and the ultimate legacy of this pervasive and devastating trade. The story is long, and its details are often difficult to confront, but it is a story that demands to be told, to be remembered, and to be understood in its full, unvarnished truth. The screams of the past echo through time, and it is our responsibility to listen. This journey through the horrors of the Viking slave market is far from over. The layers of suffering, the intricacies of the trade, and the lasting impact on both the enslaved and the enslavers are subjects that require detailed and unflinching examination. We have only just begun to scratch the surface of this profound human tragedy. The tales of individual endurance, the grim statistics of the trade, and the long shadow it cast over the emerging nations of Europe are still to be fully explored. The silent suffering of the thralls, the forgotten people of the Viking Age, calls out from history, demanding our attention and our understanding. The very infrastructure of Viking society was, in many ways, subsidized by the constant influx of enslaved labor. From the construction of impressive longhouses, some stretching for dozens of meters, to the complex earthworks and fortifications that protected their trading towns and settlements, the raw physical power required was often supplied by thralls. Imagine the sheer effort involved in felling vast forests, shaping massive timbers, and then transporting them to building sites without modern machinery. This arduous work, often performed under the threat of violence and with inadequate sustenance, was the daily reality for countless enslaved individuals. Their sweat and blood literally built the foundations of Viking power and prosperity. Furthermore, the domestic sphere was equally reliant on enslaved labor. In larger households, thrall women would be responsible for an endless cycle of tasks: grinding grain for bread, brewing ale, spinning wool into yarn, weaving cloth for clothing, preparing meals, cleaning, and caring for the children of their masters. This constant, unremitting labor freed the free women of the household to manage the estate, supervise other thralls, or engage in more specialized crafts. The very leisure and comfort enjoyed by the free population were predicated on the ceaseless toil of the enslaved. The legal status of a thrall was, as previously mentioned, that of property. This meant they could be inherited, gifted, or mortgaged. If a master died, their thralls were part of the estate, to be divided among heirs like any other possession. This meant a thrall could be passed from one owner to another multiple times in their life, each transition bringing new uncertainties, new masters, and potentially new cruelties. They had no say in their destiny, their lives entirely dictated by the economic and social machinations of others. The Gragas, the medieval Icelandic law codes, for example, provide chilling insights into the legal framework surrounding thralls. They detail the minimal provisions masters were required to provide, just enough food and clothing to sustain them for work, and the severe penalties for thralls who attempted to escape or defy their masters. These laws codified their status as chattel, reinforcing the societal acceptance of their dehumanization. The laws also specified that if a free man had a child with a thrall woman, the child would inherit the mother's status, meaning they would also be born into slavery. This was a crucial mechanism for perpetuating the thrall population and ensuring a continuous supply of labor for the owning class. The children of thralls born into bondage knew no other life. From their earliest days, they would be taught their place in the hierarchy, instructed in the tasks they were expected to perform, and conditioned to accept their fate. Their childhoods were not spent in play and learning, but in performing small chores, gradually transitioning into full-time labor as they grew. This intergenerational aspect of slavery meant that the trauma and degradation were passed down, creating entire lineages of people who knew nothing but servitude. It was a cycle of despair, with very few avenues for escape. Escape for a thrall was an incredibly dangerous undertaking. Without resources, without allies, and often without knowledge of the local geography or language, a runaway thrall faced immense odds. If caught, the punishments were severe, often involving mutilation, the loss of an ear, a hand, or an eye, as a permanent mark of their transgression and a deterrent to others. Some might even face death. This extreme retribution served to instill fear and maintain control over the enslaved population, making overt resistance incredibly risky. Yet despite the overwhelming odds, there were instances of defiance. Subtle acts of sabotage, slowing down work, or even outright rebellion, though rare, are hinted at in some historical accounts. The human spirit, even under the most oppressive conditions, often finds ways to resist, however small. These acts, though often met with brutal suppression, stand as testaments to the enduring desire for freedom. The cultural impact of the slave trade on the raided communities was catastrophic. Entire villages were depopulated, their economies shattered, and their social structures dismantled. The constant threat of Viking raids, driven by the demand for plunder and slaves, created an atmosphere of pervasive fear and insecurity. Communities were forced to build fortifications, to abandon coastal settlements, and to live in a state of perpetual vigilance. This long-term instability had profound effects on the development of these societies, diverting resources and energy away from growth and towards defense. For example, the widespread practice of raiding monasteries and churches in the British Isles and Francia was not solely driven by anti-Christian sentiment, although that played a role. These institutions were often wealthy, lightly defended, and contained a concentrated population of monks, nuns, and lay servants, all potential thralls. The systematic targeting of these religious centers speaks to the calculated economic logic behind the Viking raids. The precious liturgical objects were valuable plunder, but the human beings within were equally, if not more, valuable as commodities for the slave markets. The long-term effects of this human trafficking extended far beyond the Viking Age itself. The genetic imprint of these movements of people can still be traced in modern populations. The descendants of enslaved people, forcibly relocated across continents, contributed to the diverse genetic tapestry of the lands where they ultimately settled. This silent, biological legacy serves as another powerful reminder of the vast scale and enduring impact of the Viking slave trade. The moral implications of this era are stark. While slavery was a widespread practice in many societies throughout history, the scale, systematic nature, and the sheer brutality of the Viking slave trade stand out. It was not merely a byproduct of warfare. It was a deliberate, organized industry that fueled much of their economic expansion. The normalization of this horror within Viking society, the casual acceptance of human beings as property, is perhaps the most chilling aspect of all. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about human nature, about the capacity for cruelty, and about the ease with which one group of people can dehumanize another for economic gain. As we continue to explore the depths of this dark history, we will uncover more details about the specific fates of thralls, their occasional paths to manumission, and the ways in which their presence shaped the very identity of the Norse world. The story of the Viking slave market is a complex tapestry woven with threads of terror, resilience, and unimaginable suffering, a narrative that demands our full attention and a deep understanding of its profound and lasting impact. The echoes of their suffering still resonate, inviting us to bear witness to a truth that history, at times, prefers to keep hidden. The Viking slave markets were not just places of brutal commerce. They were also melting pots of cultures, albeit under the most horrific circumstances. Captives from diverse backgrounds, Anglo-Saxons, Celts, Franks, Slavs, Balts, and even other Norse peoples captured in internal conflicts, would find themselves huddled together, sharing a common fate. This forced proximity, this shared trauma, sometimes led to unexpected bonds, a silent solidarity born of mutual suffering. While language barriers often created additional isolation, the universal language of despair and fear needed no translation. In these markets, the very concept of identity was fluid and constantly under attack. A thrall's original name, their family lineage, their cultural traditions, all were systematically stripped away. They were given new names, new roles, and forced to adapt to a new alien culture. This process of deculturation was an integral part of their enslavement, designed to sever their ties to their past and make them more compliant. Yet traces of their original identities, their languages, their stories, must have persisted in whispers, in hidden rituals, in the shared memories of those who endured together. The existence of runestones, some of which mention thralls, offers tantalizing, if brief, glimpses into their lives. Occasionally, a thrall might be mentioned in an inscription, perhaps as part of a list of possessions, or in rarer cases, as a person who had achieved a degree of prominence or even freedom. These inscriptions, carved in stone, are poignant reminders of the individual lives caught within this vast system, offering a fleeting moment of recognition for those who were largely rendered invisible by history. The process of manumission, while rare, did exist. A thrall might be freed by their master as a reward for exceptional loyalty or service, or perhaps as an act of piety, especially as Christianity began to spread through Scandinavia. Some thralls might even be able to buy their own freedom if they managed to accumulate enough wealth through small allowances or by performing extra work for others. However, the price of freedom was often exorbitant, requiring years, if not decades, of relentless saving and sacrifice. Even after manumission, a former thrall, now a Lessinger, would still occupy a lower social status, often facing discrimination and limited opportunities. They were free in name only, still bound by invisible chains of social hierarchy and economic dependency. The freed thrall might work the same lands they had once tended as slaves, but now as tenant farmers, indebted to their former masters, their freedom a hollow echo of what it should have been. This quasi-freedom was perhaps another form of cruelty, offering the tantalizing illusion of liberation while maintaining the structures of oppression. The seasonal nature of Viking raiding added another dimension to the horror of the slave trade. Spring and summer were the prime raiding seasons, when the weather was favorable for sea voyages and when coastal settlements were most active and vulnerable. This meant that the slave markets experienced cyclical surges, with fresh captives arriving each autumn as the raiders returned from their expeditions. The anticipation of these arrivals, the preparation of holding facilities, and the gathering of buyers created a grotesque seasonal economy built on human misery. During the winter months, when raiding was impractical, the focus shifted to the management and utilization of existing thrall populations. This was when masters would assess their human property, deciding who to keep, who to sell, and who might no longer be worth feeding. The harsh Scandinavian winters were particularly brutal for thralls, who were often housed in the most rudimentary shelters and given the least food. Many did not survive these cold months, their weakened bodies succumbing to disease, malnutrition, and exposure. For the survivors, each spring brought both the relief of warmer weather and the terror of knowing that new captives would soon arrive, potentially displacing them or reducing their already meager rations. The role of women in this system was particularly complex and harrowing. Female thralls were valued not only for their labor, but also for their reproductive capacity. They were seen as breeding stock, their children automatically becoming the property of their masters. This biological exploitation added layers of trauma to their enslavement, as they were forced to bear children who would inherit their bondage. The maternal bond, one of the strongest human connections, became another source of anguish as mothers watched their children grow up in chains, knowing they were powerless to protect them or secure their freedom. Concubinage was a common fate for many female thralls, particularly those considered attractive by their masters. This sexual exploitation was not only legal, but was often seen as a privilege granted by the master. The children born from these unions occupied an ambiguous position in Norse society. While still technically thralls, they were often treated somewhat better than other enslaved individuals due to their paternal connection. However, this marginal improvement came at the cost of their mother's autonomy and dignity, and the children themselves lived with the constant reminder of the violence that had brought them into existence. The markets themselves evolved over time, becoming increasingly sophisticated in their operations. Professional slave traders emerged, individuals who specialized in the capture, transport, and sale of human beings. These merchants developed networks that span continents, establishing regular trade routes and building relationships with suppliers and customers. They became experts in evaluating human cargo, knowing which types of thralls would sell well in different markets and how to maximize their profits from each shipment. The infrastructure supporting these markets was extensive. Holding facilities were constructed near major trading centers, designed to house large numbers of captives while they awaited sale. These structures were essentially human warehouses, built for efficiency rather than comfort. Captives were often chained or confined in cramped conditions, with minimal sanitation and basic sustenance. Disease spread rapidly in these environments, and many thralls who survived the initial capture and transport perished in these holding facilities before they could even reach the auction block. The psychological warfare employed against thralls was systematic and devastating. Beyond the physical brutality, masters and traders used various methods to break the spirits of their captives. Public humiliation, arbitrary punishment, and the constant threat of violence were all tools in this arsenal of oppression. Thralls were often forced to witness the punishment of others, creating an atmosphere of terror that discouraged resistance and fostered compliance. The randomness of these punishments was particularly effective, as it created a sense of helplessness and unpredictability that wore down even the strongest wills. Language became another weapon in this psychological warfare. Thralls were often forbidden from speaking their native languages, forced instead to communicate only in Norse. This linguistic oppression severed one of their last connections to their original identities and cultures. Over time, as native languages were forgotten and Norse became their primary means of communication, another link to their past was permanently broken. The loss of language represented not just a practical constraint, but a profound cultural death, as the songs, stories, and traditions encoded in their native tongues were silenced forever. The medical treatment of thralls reveals another dimension of their dehumanization. While masters had economic incentives to keep their human property healthy enough to work, the medical care provided was minimal and utilitarian. Serious injuries or illnesses often meant death, as the cost of treatment was weighed against the thrall's potential value. Pregnant thrall women might receive slightly better care, but only to protect the valuable offspring they carried. This cold calculation of human worth, based purely on economic utility, stripped away any pretense of compassion or basic human decency. The religious implications of slavery within Viking society were complex and evolved over time. Traditional Norse religion did not explicitly condemn slavery, and the pantheon included gods who owned thralls. The concept of fate weird was often used to justify the enslaved condition, suggesting that thralls were destined for bondage and that resistance was futile. However, as Christianity began to penetrate Scandinavian society, new tensions arose. Christian teachings about the equality of all souls before God conflicted with the practice of slavery, though this conflict was often resolved through theological gymnastics that allowed the continuation of the practice while paying lip service to Christian ideals. The conversion to Christianity did not immediately end slavery in Scandinavia, but it did gradually change the discourse around the practice. Some masters began to view the manumission of thralls as a pious act that might earn them spiritual merit. Churches sometimes served as sanctuaries where escaped thralls might seek refuge, though the protection offered was often limited and temporary. The slow Christianization of Scandinavian society represented a gradual shift in values, but this transformation took centuries, and countless thralls lived and died in bondage before any meaningful change occurred. The economic calculations behind the slave trade were ruthlessly precise. Traders developed sophisticated methods for evaluating the profitability of different types of captives. Young, healthy individuals commanded the highest prices, while children represented long-term investments that would provide decades of service. Skilled craftsmen were particularly valuable, as their expertise could generate ongoing income for their masters. Women of childbearing age were prized for their dual capacity as workers and producers of future thralls. These cold economic assessments reduced human beings to mere data points in a profit calculation, stripping away any recognition of their humanity or inherent worth. The transportation networks that moved thralls across vast distances were marvels of logistics, albeit horrifying ones. The eastern routes, following the great rivers of Russia, required careful coordination of supplies, guards, and river pilots. The risks were enormous: attacks by hostile tribes, shipwrecks, disease outbreaks, and the constant threat of thrall uprisings. Yet the potential profits were so substantial that traders continued to brave these dangers year after year. The successful completion of these journeys required not only logistical expertise, but also a callous disregard for human suffering that allowed traders to treat their human cargo as disposable commodities. Archaeological evidence continues to reveal new insights into the extent and nature of Viking slavery. Excavations at trading centers like Hedeby and Birka have uncovered evidence of the infrastructure that supported the slave trade: specialized buildings that may have served as holding facilities, iron shackles and chains, and grave goods that suggest the presence of people from diverse cultural backgrounds who may have been enslaved. These physical remnants provide tangible evidence of practices that written sources sometimes obscure or minimize. DNA analysis of skeletal remains has also begun to reveal the genetic legacy of the Viking slave trade. Populations in Scandinavia show genetic markers from across Europe and beyond, suggesting that many enslaved individuals eventually integrated into the local populations, either through manumission or through the gradual blurring of social boundaries over generations. This genetic evidence provides another perspective on the scale of the slave trade and its lasting impact on the demographic composition of Northern Europe. The resistance movements that did emerge were often localized and short-lived, but they represent important examples of human resilience in the face of overwhelming oppression. Some thralls organized escape attempts, though these required careful planning and tremendous courage. Others engaged in subtle forms of resistance, working slowly, damaging tools, or providing poor-quality work. While these acts of defiance rarely led to freedom, they represented assertions of human dignity and agency in circumstances designed to strip away both. The few documented cases of successful thrall revolts provide glimpses into the potential for organized resistance. These uprisings were typically brutally suppressed, with survivors facing horrific punishments designed to deter future rebellions. The fact that such revolts occurred at all, despite the overwhelming odds against success, speaks to the unconquerable human desire for freedom and the lengths to which people will go to reclaim their autonomy. The impact of the slave trade on Norse mythology and literature is subtle but discernible. While the sagas and Eddas were primarily concerned with the deeds of heroes and gods, thralls occasionally appear in these narratives, usually as background figures or plot devices. However, their very presence in these stories reflects the pervasive nature of slavery in Viking society. The casual way in which enslavement is mentioned in these texts reveals how normalized the practice had become, integrated into the very fabric of Norse civilization. The economic disruption caused by large-scale slave raiding extended far beyond the immediate victims. Entire regions lived under the constant threat of Viking attacks, forcing them to divert resources from productive activities to defense. Coastal settlements were often abandoned or heavily fortified, altering settlement patterns and economic development. The chronic insecurity created by slave raids contributed to political instability and hindered the development of trade and agriculture in affected areas. The seasonal patterns of the slave trade created unique forms of terror for vulnerable populations. The approach of spring brought not just the promise of warmer weather and growing seasons, but also the knowledge that Viking raiders would soon be setting sail. Coastal communities developed elaborate warning systems, using signal fires and horn calls to alert neighboring settlements of approaching danger. Children grew up with the constant awareness that they might be snatched from their homes and families at any moment, creating a pervasive atmosphere of anxiety and fear. The documentation of specific slave markets provides chilling insights into the organization and scale of the trade. The market at Dublin, established by Viking raiders in the 9th century, became one of the largest slave trading centers in Western Europe. Contemporary accounts describe thousands of captives being processed through this market annually, with buyers arriving from across the Norse world and beyond. The sheer volume of human trafficking represented by these numbers is staggering, representing countless individual tragedies and shattered lives. The role of slave labor in Viking exploration and expansion cannot be understated. The construction of the longships that carried Norse raiders and traders across the oceans required enormous amounts of skilled and unskilled labor. Thralls felled the massive trees, shaped the timbers, and provided the manpower needed to build these vessels. In a very real sense, the boats that enabled Viking expansion were built by the very people who had been victimized by previous raids, creating a cruel cycle where the enslaved built the instruments of their own people's future enslavement. The establishment of Viking colonies in places like Iceland, Greenland, and eventually North America relied heavily on enslaved labor. The harsh conditions and enormous physical demands of creating new settlements in these remote and challenging environments required large workforces. Thralls cleared forests, built structures, tended livestock, and performed the countless tasks necessary to establish viable communities. The romantic image of Viking explorers and pioneers is darkened considerably when we acknowledge the enslaved individuals whose labor made these achievements possible. The long-term demographic impact of slave raiding was profound. Some regions of Europe, particularly in the Celtic fringe and Slavic territories, experienced significant population decline as a result of repeated raids. Young adults, the most productive members of society, were preferentially targeted by slave raiders, leaving behind communities dominated by children and the elderly. This demographic disruption had cascading effects on economic productivity, cultural transmission, and social stability that persisted long after the Viking Age had ended. The transformation of thralls into valuable trade commodities created perverse incentives that shaped Viking society in fundamental ways. Successful raids that captured large numbers of slaves could make their leaders incredibly wealthy, providing the resources needed to organize even larger expeditions. This created a self-reinforcing cycle where success in slave raiding enabled further expansion of the practice. The most successful Viking leaders were often those who proved most adept at capturing and selling human beings, a grim calculus that prioritized brutality and exploitation over other forms of achievement. The specialized knowledge required to operate in the slave trade created a professional class of human traffickers who developed expertise in every aspect of the business. They knew which populations were most vulnerable to attack, which trade routes were most profitable, which markets offered the best prices for different types of captives, and how to manage large groups of enslaved people during long journeys. This professionalization of human trafficking made the system more efficient and more brutal, as experienced slavers refined their methods over generations of practice. The seasonal cycles of the slave trade created unique forms of temporal terror for both captives and vulnerable populations. Winter months offered respite from raiding, but brought their own horrors for enslaved individuals, who faced increased mortality from cold, disease, and reduced rations. Spring brought the terror of renewed raiding activity, while summer marked the peak season for both capture and sale. Autumn was when the year's harvest of human beings reached the markets, creating seasonal price fluctuations based on supply and demand. The documentation of individual stories, while rare, provides heartbreaking glimpses into the personal dimension of this vast tragedy. Arabic sources occasionally mention specific individuals: a fair-haired woman from the north, a skilled craftsman, a child who caught a buyer's attention. These brief mentions represent lives completely disrupted, families destroyed, and futures stolen. Behind each casual reference to slaves from the north lie countless untold stories of suffering, loss, and dehumanization. The legacy of Viking slavery extended far beyond the end of the Viking Age itself. The trade networks established for human trafficking often continued to be used for other forms of commerce, creating lasting economic connections across Europe and beyond. The social structures that developed to manage enslaved populations influenced legal systems and social hierarchies for centuries. The normalization of human bondage in Scandinavian society created cultural attitudes that persisted long after the practice itself had been abandoned. As we confront the full scope and horror of the Viking slave trade, we must remember that this was not an aberration, but a central feature of Norse society for centuries. It was not a byproduct of their expansion, but one of its primary drivers. The wealth that funded their expeditions, the labor that built their settlements, and the commodities that made their merchants rich were all intimately connected to the systematic enslavement of human beings. The screams that echoed through the slave markets of Hedeby, Dublin, and countless other trading centers represent one of history's great silenced voices. These were people with names, families, hopes, and dreams, all reduced to commodities in a vast machine of human exploitation. Their suffering built the foundations of Viking power and prosperity. Their labor enabled Norse expansion, and their lives were sacrificed on the altar of Northern European ambition. The horrors of the Viking slave market stand as a stark reminder of humanity's capacity for cruelty and exploitation. They force us to confront uncomfortable truths about the past and challenge romanticized narratives that gloss over inconvenient realities. Only by acknowledging and understanding these dark chapters can we hope to learn from them and work to ensure that such systematic dehumanization never occurs again. The echoes of their suffering still reverberate through time, demanding our attention, our understanding, and our commitment to honoring their memory by never forgetting the price paid for the achievements we celebrate in history. In remembering the thralls, the forgotten people of the Viking Age, we give voice to the voiceless and acknowledge the full, terrible truth of a past that shaped our world in ways we are still discovering.